Welcome. This is Hernan Murdoch, and in this episode we're going to talk about audit findings. When auditors perform their reviews, they identify anomalies, and these need to be communicated. So we would like to get some more clarity around what the standards say about those. So we have with us Kathleen Crawford, who will help us better understand what the standards say about documenting audit findings. Welcome, Kathleen.
Hi, Hernan.
So the standards say that we need to document observations and discrepancies and so on. Those are usually labeled as findings. So can you help us take a look at what the standards say about those and what we need to keep in mind as we document these events?
Absolutely. So first off, we have a standard on communicating results. It's pretty straightforward. Internal auditors must communicate the results of their engagements. So everything that we did, whether it comes out well or it comes out not so well, we have to communicate with our stakeholders. So the people that we're auditing, their leadership, and perhaps some secondary parties as well. We need to make sure that we communicate our results. Then the standards go on to talk about criteria for communicating. We must include the engagement's objectives and scope, as well as applicable conclusions, recommendations, and action plans.
Is this so that the reader has sense of context when reading the observations, so they understand the scope, the objectives, and so on before they get into the actual deficiencies noted?
Yes, absolutely. That is what we see as necessary.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The criteria for communicating have a couple of sub-level, I guess you would call, standards as well. The next one here on the graphic is 2410.A1, which applies to assurance engagements and essentially says that we have to communicate our opinion and our conclusions. So it's not enough to say we did this work, but what do we feel about it? What do we believe about how well the area process or system is running? So that opinion or conclusion must take into account expectations of those stakeholders, which I had referenced previously, as well as be supported by evidence that's sufficient, reliable, relevant, and useful. So standard 2420.A1 applies to assurance engagements. Then we have some others. A2 tells us that we are encouraged to acknowledge satisfactory performance in engagement communications. And this is pretty important because in the end, when there is an audit report that goes out, and that's part of this communicating of findings, but the final opinion is usually relatively brief in balance or on balance with how many things we looked at. So any opportunity for us to acknowledge satisfactory performance is one that we should take.
As we think about internal auditors trying to build positive relationships with their clients, I believe that this is very important because quite often they associate the auditors as only referring to, talking about, writing about the things that are negative, the deficiencies, if you will. But the standards clearly state that we should acknowledge it when it's noted during the course of the work. So in a way, I think this is a great opportunity to show that we are fair, we're balanced, and we're looking at everything. As opposed to just focusing on the negative items, which some people refer to as the gotcha mindset of the auditor, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Standard 2410.A3 goes on to say that if we're releasing engagement results to parties outside the organization, we must have communication around the limitations for distribution and the use of the results. So audit work is sensitive work, and if we're releasing information to outside parties, it's important to have rules of engagement around that and what is within bounds and what is not within bounds.
Okay, great.
There's another standard here. This one relates to consulting engagements. 2410.C1 says that our communication on progress and results of consulting engagements will vary in form and content depending on the nature of the engagement and the needs of the client. For our viewers' benefit, this is a very common way of phrasing some of the consulting standards as opposed to the assurance standards. The assurance standards you can you can sense that these are pretty straightforward and the expectations are clear. With consulting standards, they may be a little bit less so. They tend to be phrased more flexibly because the nature of the engagement might be very different from time to time and situation to situation.
Quite often, the assurance-related standards will use the word must. Is that right?
Yes, yes. So something that's, more definitive, more a requirement. Whereas consulting engagements a little bit more flexible. The rules of engagement are established between the auditor and the group that they're auditing, and they have a lot more say in terms of the client has a lot more say in terms of what we would be looking at. In fact, many of these engagements are requests. They're requesting us to come in and take a look at something that isn't working as expected or seems to look a little odd in some way.
Okay.
And then my personal favorite is quality of communications.
Yes.
I really do. I like the fact that the IIA recognized that there's a lot of detail and there's a lot riding on communication. And this standard articulates 7 adjectives. These adjectives don't always align. In fact, sometimes they compete with each other. So we're going to try to find a balance between being accurate, objective, clear, concise, constructive, complete, and timely. Not an easy balance to strike, but that's the objective.
That's the objective. Great.
So we also have some standards around monitoring progress of the work. So the chief audit executive must establish a system for monitoring how we dispose of communications related to management or communications to management. So that's something that we need to monitor and measure. If you think about communicating during the fieldwork portion of the audit, as we notice things that seem inconsistent with what our expectations were, we will send out some kind of a memo, have meetings, and so forth. And until such time as that conflict or that difference is resolved between what we expected to see and what we actually found, we need to have a well-established monitoring progress during field work. And then if we're also talking about something that's communicated in the audit report, there needs to be an effective follow-up process to ensure that management actions have been taken. So this one's 2500.A1 speaks to that.
So this is somewhat of a database that must be maintained to capture all of the exceptions and make sure that management is taking action and that they're meeting the deadline for corrective action. Is that right?
Yes. And there'll be some kind of template to carry that through.
In practice, some of the monitoring activities can happen in short order. So if you have a very high-risk situation, it may be a matter of days or even a few weeks when we may start to ask about making sure those things are resolved. But then on more typical type of situations, I suppose, they can go on for a few months where we give them enough time to address those. And another thing that I found to be interesting is also the need for transactions to go through as relates to certain controls. So it's not just that they change the procedure and added that control if necessary, but that transactions went through that and were affected by that new control, so that if the auditors need to retest, they can then evidence that that control is in fact now working and the problem has been remediated.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that monitoring of progress really does matter. One other thing that A1 speaks to is that management has the prerogative to accept the risk or to accept the recommendation that we might make. And that is absolutely true. What newer auditors should be alert to, though, is whether or not the delegations of authority of someone that they're speaking with is actually empowered to make that, to make that call, if you will. So it is true that management does have that prerogative. That's what they that's what they've been hired to, is to have a good sense of risk and the balance of control that's necessary for whatever objectives they're trying to accomplish. But we have to be mindful of who is making that decision, and is it at the right level?
Exactly. Yes, at the end of the day, the internal audit department and the chief audit executive is responsible for making sure that these things are reasonable. And if management is accepting a risk that is outside of what is considered prudent and acceptable, that needs to be communicated to the audit committee to let them know that this is going on and if they want to take further action on these items. So this is great information. So we have a better appreciation for what the audit findings are about and how we need to make sure. And I like what you mentioned also about those 7 attributes and making sure that it meets all of those, because communications are central to what needs to be done during a review and communicating the results back out to the stakeholders so they understand the implications. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
If you like this series, subscribe to the ACI Learning YouTube channel to enjoy more audit-related content.